Hello. So the biggest news have been, of course, the visits of Xi Jinping to Russia and of Fumio Kishida to Ukraine. The big news on the international scale has also been Putin's announcement on the deployment of the transfer of nuclear weapons to Belarus, on his intention to do so. We're also going to once again reassess the tempo of arms and ammunition being delivered to Ukraine, what new initiatives there are there. We're going to refer back to the topic of DeSantis and other politicians in the US, how they perceive the war in Ukraine and what their comments may mean. And finally, we're going to talk about the intended recognition of Holodomor as a genocide of Ukrainians by France.
Right. So these are our topics, and we hope to discuss them in detail in this podcast. Let us start with this China and Japan situation. You have rightly pointed out that we see actually a big difference, right, with in the attitude of China and Japan to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Xi Jinping is visiting Russia, while Fumio Kishida, the Japan's prime minister, is visiting Ukraine, and not only Ukraine, he went to the places of Russian war crimes like Bucha. Can you tell us a little bit more about Japan's prime minister's visit, how it is different from the Xi Jinping visit to Russia, how we see this, opposing attitudes of two major countries of Asia?
Well, in order to understand the importance of this visit, there are two things that need to be articulated here. First of all, that it coincided in time with the visit of Xi Jinping to Russia. So one can assume that this was a message about this competition being on different sides by the Asian powers on the different sides of this war in Ukraine. So that's the first. And second, the visit of the Japanese prime minister, in my opinion, has not been as much about the bilateral agenda between Ukraine and Japan, but about the global geopolitical dimension of the conflict of Russia's war against Ukraine. Because whereas China is more or less, let's say, one can conclude, is taking Russia's side, or at least is sending certain signals of its readiness to negotiate with Putin and to make friends with Putin. At the same time, Japan, as the representative of the geopolitical West in Asian region, and as a party standing off with China, it shows its support to Ukraine. It is important because there is going to be a G7 summit next month, I think, and Japan is going to be presiding there. It's going to be in Japan. And of course, the war in Ukraine is going to be on the agenda. And given Japan's background of the standoff with China in the region, and also with its territorial disputes with Russia over the islands, so it is important for Japan to lead this effort to promote this Western approach about the international law, about the conflict settlement, about the aggressors needing to back down, and for the existence of need to punish them. So this is a worldview, a standoff between different worldviews that China and Japan represent in these respective visits of Xi Jinping to Russia and Fumio Kishida to Ukraine.
I don't think that we might call it a Western vision. I think it is better to call it the vision which is based on the UN Charter, right? And this is also very important that the support of Ukraine is going far beyond what we generally call the geopolitical West. It goes far beyond these countries. It goes to also to Asian countries. It goes to Latin American countries, some of the African countries as well. So this coalition is much wider than what we are calling the West. At the same time, I think it is also important to note that, Xi Jinping, when he was visiting Russia, he was also announcing that he's going to have a phone conversation with President Zelensky. And this, up to my knowledge, hasn't happened. And we don't know whether it will be happening. So if China wants to really position itself as a negotiator, as a mediator, Xi Jinping will need to talk to Zelensky. And the question is why and how Zelensky will agree to talk. because obviously if Zelensky agrees to talk with Xi Jinping, even on the phone, that will give a huge geopolitical card for China, who would say, look, we are really the mediators, we are the peacekeepers, we bring peace, we are able to put negotiations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now we are able to to organize negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, or be a mediator. So indeed, you're right that we increasingly see this polarization between Japan and China. Japan supporting Ukraine, the victim of aggression, and China supporting the aggressor. What next? The next topic is Belarus and nuclear weapons in Belarus. And here, Chinese question is also present, because on the one hand, there are new news that China is opposing this nuclear blackmail by Russia. On the other hand, we have seen recently the visit of Belarus dictator Lukashenko to China. And quite probably Lukashenko could also serve as a kind of the third partner in this authoritarian axis between China and Belarus. Can you, Maxim, tell us more about this?
Yes, so basically what happened is that Putin, reportedly, according to himself, in response to the West's further deployment, well, not deployment, but transfer of arms to Ukraine, Russia has decided to, as Putin said, respond to the calls of Minsk and to deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Belarusian territory. And further details on these are hazy, because on the one hand, Putin went as far as in his detail as to say that Russia would prepare Belarusian fighter jet teams, aviation experts, etc., etc. So those would assumingly be Belarusians, and that would be the breach of the international law on the non-proliferation of nuclear arms. But at the same time, he said that Russia was not going to breach, because it would only station nuclear weapons in the Belarusian territory, but it would be administered by Russia still. So there is a lot of haziness around this, and I think that was Putin's intention to put it that way, for the world not to be sure, but to refrain from too bold moves just in case. So I think that was the idea all along. But either way, as you said, yes, indeed, this can be embedded in a wider picture of how China sees things, because once again, China has on several occasions, I think, emphasized that the nuclear component to this conflict, to this war, should not exist. And so this act of disobedience, shall I put it this way, of Russia toward China is very interesting indeed. So this is, maybe there are more games within the axis that we have been talking about, this Belarus, Russia, Iran, China, then, that means the eye. Maybe there are some issues that still are painful between themselves. So everybody should be keeping a close eye.
Yes, and we should also not forget that one of the causes of this war is that Ukraine actually gave up its nuclear weapons according to Budapest Memorandum, and in 1994, and Russia would certainly not attack Ukraine if Ukraine had the nuclear weapons, right? And the Budapest Memorandum also included the guarantees of the nuclear powers, including Russia, including United States, including UK, and these guarantees also don't really seem to work, obviously. The second issue is, Belarus is a good mask for Putin, has always been a good mask, because during this war, because we perfectly know that Russia has attacked Ukraine, including from the Belarusian territory. If Russia did not use the Belarusian territory for its attack, there would be no attack on Kyiv, there would be no tragedies of genocidal tragedies of Bucha. Russians attacked Kyiv from Belarus, and this is also very important to remember. Imagine if Russia really deploys the nuclear weapons in Belarus. on the one hand, it will certainly be a breach of the international law and the Treaty of Non-Proliferation. On the other hand, it can always say that if something happens, if, for example, there is a nuclear strike from Belarusian territory on Ukraine or on any other country, because we have seen Belarusian propagandists, in the aggressive style. Some of them are even more aggressive than the Russian propagandists. They were saying, they were threatening clearly Poland, Baltic states, Central Europe, Germany, and other states, right? And Russia can say, look, it's not us. It's Belarus. It's Lukashenko. He's mad. And therefore, it seems that one of the elements of this tactics is to use some mad guys, even more mad than Putin, like Bashar al-Assad in Syria, or in the Russian case, people like Prigozhin or Kadyrov, and give them, even more capacity of cruel action. So this also might happen. So Belarus is a kind of a curtain, is a kind of a mask of Russia itself. We should also keep that in mind. Okay, so what's next? We can also discuss the arms supplies to Ukraine. What can you say about this?
Well, this topic is a two-edged sword, as they say, because there have been several instances during the last week of good news for Ukraine. And it should be emphasized here that all of them come from the media, from the revelations of different media outlets in the West, in Europe, or in the US, rather than being any formal statements from governments. So that should be kept in mind. But on the other hand, there are increasingly bigger problems with the decline of attention to Ukraine in the world because of the domestic problems or international problems in different countries or in different continents. So when we're talking about the first part of what I said about the good news, tentatively, because again, they are from the media, it seems that, they are on news that Ukraine is going to receive a couple of dozens of planes, fighter jets, Mirage fighter jets from France. This is not confirmed yet, as I said, but still, if it is true, it would be a breakthrough, because that would be a first instance when a Western fighter jets is being given to Ukraine. But again, of course, the timeline here is very important, how long this will be happening and how soon it will be happening. What is even more important, maybe, in the context of the present-day needs of Ukraine, of the immediate needs of Ukraine, is that Bulgaria has reportedly found a way to export through third countries a big amount of ammunition to Ukraine. And I think one of the ex-military officials in Bulgaria has told media that the amount is so big that it is even going to be able to change the situation at the front lines drastically. So fingers crossed, of course, because once again, this only comes from media as of the time being. But we remember that Bulgaria supported Ukraine in the early month of the Russian invasion, the full-scale invasion, and that also was later characterized as a game changer, because Ukraine would have been far worse off without that support, and Bulgaria only declared that it had happened, Ukraine, only I think maybe 6 to 9 months after that. So, as I said, fingers crossed that what's now going on is just, and the shortage of information is due to the clandestine nature of this, rather than about this not being true. But on the other hand, as I said, we can discuss this further, there is this big problem with the further decline of attention to Ukraine, which is more and more palpable. For instance, if you take France, where you, Volodymyr, are now, and maybe you can tell us a little bit more from the ground about what's happening, but there are rallies connected with the pension reform that the government is trying to implement in France. So there is that there. And of course, the government's attention and Mr. Macron's attention will be diverted incrementally from Ukraine, or can be. There is a risk of that. In the US, there is an increasingly bigger pivot to the period, the presidential elections period, to the primaries, etc., with all of that approaching. And of course, much of what they're saying about Ukraine, inter alia, and Russia's war in Ukraine, it should be understood that those statements are made for the sake of the political gains domestically in the US, for the sake of the primaries, rather than for the sincere support of Ukraine. Sometimes those things can coincide in favor of Ukraine, but sometimes they can contradict if you take, for instance, statements by Mr. Trump. So there is that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There is this danger of forgetting this war, or at least paying not so much attention. We clearly see it from our experience, from Ukraine world experience, after the anniversary, and this is what we have expected. Actually, after the anniversary of the full-scale invasion, we have much lesser addresses by the foreign media for commentary, for op-eds, for writing. And indeed, I am in Paris right now, so I was this morning at France Info, the French radio, and this is also was the question that I was asked. I think it was the first question I was asked, whether we consider that the West or international partners of Ukraine start to forgetting this war. I don't have the impression that the forgetting is the right word, but there is, of course, the risk that the war continues. We understand that it's lots of tragedies, lots of pain on the front line. Russia continues to shell Ukrainian cities, towns with missiles. Several days ago, there was an attack on Slovyansk. Several people killed. Yesterday, there was an attack by Shaheds, the Iranian drones on Ukrainian cities, including Kyiv, and there were some places in Kyiv targeted, and there were explosions. And of course, on the front line, on the Eastern Front, people are dying every day. A very, very difficult situation around Bakhmut, around Avdiivka. But all that is not really so much in the media attention anymore. And this is dangerous, because it can also influence the policy decisions. It can push for decrease of the public support of Ukraine, and many, many other things. So we, of course, call our audiences and call our international partners to continue following the Ukrainian agenda and to continue supporting Ukraine. Unfortunately, this is a war. This is a long war, and it is already a long war since 2014. And it will be a long war, given the fact that China is increasingly on the side of Russia. And therefore, I mean, we should be prepared for being resilient as well, and in time. That doesn't mean, of course, that we can exclude the drastic changes, and we can exclude the quick finishing of this war, for example, with successful Ukrainian counteroffensive. But we should also understand that Russians are preparing for this too, and they are fortifying their positions in the east and in the south. Okay, so despite this decline of attention, we see some very pronounced statements about Ukraine still from the different politicians in Europe, in the United States. We have seen, for example, recently a powerful statement by Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, and we have seen also some change of rhetoric among the American Republicans, in particular one of the candidates, Mr. DeSantis. Can you tell us more about this?
Yes, so when it comes to Prime Minister Meloni, it was a very, indeed, pronounced example of support of Ukraine, because there were a couple of minutes of her speech dedicated to Ukraine in response to what was being discussed in the parliament when she was there delivering her speech, actually. So there was a bit of an argument in the parliament, and basically what happened is that Meloni, responding to an MP, she stated her strong and Italy's strong support to Ukraine. She said that Italy and no one, of course, can be against peace settlement, but what some parties in Europe, maybe in Italy, propose is more about Ukraine's surrender, basically, because if we just agree to a ceasefire and any negotiations take off from there, this will basically mean that an occupation is allowed, because Russia would be negotiating from the position of strength and having already occupied some of Ukraine's territories, etc. So this was, on the one hand, in the most immediate context, it was very reassuring to see that powerful of a statement to come from a leader of a major European state, major Western state. But even more importantly is to embed this into a bigger context, because Italy has always been, at least in recent years, I would say, a usual suspect for the big popularity of far-right movements that usually are much closer to Russia and to Putin himself. And even at the elections to the European Parliament, that was very visible in 2019. So to see this resolution, to see this grit on the part of the Prime Minister Meloni and her unequivocal position on supporting Ukraine amidst this risk that could be there in a country divided than many other countries are divided with respect to Ukraine, that is a big thing. And that's, of course, a big plus amid this topic about the decline of attention to Ukraine. And the second instance, as you said, Mr. DeSantis, that's the example of quite a different pair of shoes. Mr. DeSantis basically during the last week, a couple of days back, basically walked back on his comments about Ukraine, because he had previously called it a territorial dispute. So he basically downplayed the importance of what's going on. He disregarded by that comment the war crimes, and he made it just a political thing between Russia and Ukraine. And but a couple of days back, he rectified himself, saying, as politicians usually say in these instances, that his comments had been construed wrongfully, that all the territories should be Ukrainian. Well, I think he said that if I had power to use a magic wand and, do the right thing, I would give the 100% of Ukraine's territory to Ukraine. That's what he said, I think. And he also went as far as to call President Putin a war criminal. So that was a big change of rhetoric. And of course, what I'm driving here at is that this so much illustrates what I had mentioned previously, that this rhetoric and changes in rhetoric, they are so much more in the first place about the domestic agenda in the US than about the sincere support of Ukraine. And it's good when those things coincide, but we can see that DeSantis had previously been saying, well, not a very friendly thing to Ukraine, right, in the characterization of this war of Russia's. But now it apparently became more beneficial for him politically in the run-up to this political cycle in the United States. So he decided that he would be better off to rectify himself, that the fallout from his previous remarks had been bigger than he had expected. So basically we can see how that changes because of the domestic political agenda. So my message here to the listeners would be that include that in your analysis, in your personal analysis of what's going on. Please understand that when somebody is defending Putin or defending his rights, his interests in this war, do not see this as a rightful argument. Try to be more critical. Try to think that maybe this is not as clear of an argument and as it should be. So be critical.
Right, and I think another issue which is very important with both Meloni and DeSantis, and I would also add Kevin McCarthy, who is a Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives, who also said, I think on Fox News recently, I think it was past week, and that he clearly pronounced this phrase that Ukrainians actually want to hear from the politicians in the United States, that Russia has to be defeated, and that he actually supports the idea of defeat of Russia as the goal in this war. What is interesting is a question whether the political parties, the political forces on the right, I don't mean far right, but I mean the center right, are actually whether we are seeing the trend that they start to be anti-Putinist, because previously we have seen another trend that not only the far-right parties, but also the conservative parties in different countries of the world are actually have some sympathies to Putin. We could talk about this, for example, with regard to France, les Républicains, the people like Sarkozy and then Fillon and then others, right? We can talk about this, maybe a little bit about Germany. Of course, Merkel is a now controversial figure because on the one hand she was criticizing Putin, but on the other hand she allowed the continuation of the Nord Stream and the increased dependence on Germany on Russian gas. We can also, of course, mention Hungary. We can, of course, mention conservatives or right-wing parties in Italy. And the increasingly pro-Russian or Russia-friendly trend among the American Republicans around Trump. Well, I hope that with Melanie and maybe in America, let's see that we might be witnessing another trend. I mean, this right-wing, maybe center-right, but anti-Putin parties. We see that with Melanie. We obviously see that with Prawo and Sprawiedliwość in Poland, although this party is, it's a right-wing party, but with lots of dubious things around, with the attack on the public broadcaster, not the attack, but actually reforging of the judicial system, all these things that I think we need to be very critical about. But this is something that we need to think about, whether this change is possible, whether basically right-wing parties, conservative parties in Europe, in the United States, can again become anti-Russian and not pro-Russian because they think that Russia is defending, Christian values or family values or all this actually ideas of the Russian propaganda. Of course, they are not defending Christian values. That's actually an illusion, and that's actually bullshit, if I may pronounce this word on this podcast, right? So. Russia is not, and Russian Putinism is not at all a force that is protecting any conservative values. It's just a fake, just to play with these values and any other values that you can imagine. And maybe the last topic is that you mentioned about Holodomor. We indeed see a move in France. In French Parliament to recognize Holodomor as genocide, and we will follow the news in the upcoming days, despite the difficult situation around the protests about La Grève, which is here around the pension reform. And I think this is indeed important that this recognition of Holodomor as either as genocide or as crime against humanity in various different countries, which we have seen in German Bundestag, which we have seen in the European Parliament. It is really important. It is said that this trend has only started after this invasion, because we see the clear genocidal intentions of Russian army and Russian leadership. They really want to erase Ukrainians. They really want to erase the idea of Ukraine as a separate community, as a separate nation, as a separate society. And what we have been arguing on this podcast in Ukraine World is that this invasion is actually a continuation of this crime and this criminal attitude since many centuries, actually. And Holodomor, in which Stalin killed at least 4 million Ukrainian peasants in 1932, 1933, also other famines in other years as well that took place, were also the elements of this long story and the elements of this Russian impunity, actually, because what we are witnessing right now is that Putin is actually seeing himself as a continuator of this NKVD politics, Cheka politics, KGB politics. These people who are killing others either through repressions or through Holodomor, without being ever punished for that, without being ever condemned for that, without being ever brought to justice for that. They have been changing the places between the victim and the perpetrator. They were saying that victims are perpetrators and perpetrators are victims. And of course, we need to put an end to this. We need to put an end to this by defeating Russia, by defeating Putinist Russia, by defeating this ideology of Putinism, which is all based on the idea of violence, which is all based on the idea that